This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Good morning, and can I welcome everyone to the Police and Crime Committee meeting. This morning we'll be holding our monthly question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent so that we can avoid any interruptions. And can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. We've had apologies from Assembly Member Moema, for whom Assembly Member Cooper is attending as a substitute.
Thank you. And can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Nothing, thank you. And can we confirm the minutes of the meetings held on the 5th of July and the 19th of July 2023 to be signed by me as correct records? Agreed. Thank you. Can we note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence sent? Noted. And can we note the recent action taken by me as Chair under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members to agree the committee's letter to MOPAC regarding the effectiveness of its oversight of the Metropolitan Police Service? And can we note the response received from NHS England to the joint letter with the Health Committee regarding the funding of the London Ambulance Service? So we now move to our main item of business, and I would like to welcome our guests, Sophie Linden, who is Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, welcome, and Sir Mark Rowley, QPM, who is Commissioner of Police of the Metropolis, welcome. So we're going to start just with a few questions on the London Policing Board. And Deputy Mayor, I was wondering if you could provide us with an update on the progress of the establishment of the London Policing Board and when you expect it to meet for the first time.
Thanks a lot. As we all know, the London Policing Board is a recommendation from Baroness Casey's review, which we all accepted and have taken forward very quickly. You will know that we were out to advertisement and recruitment for members of the London Policing Board, and we're in the process of confirming and finalising that recruitment. We're also in the process of finalising the first meeting and the governance structures that will sit below the London Policing Board. There was a lot of work in train as we set the Policing Board up. We hope to be able to make announcements quite soon around membership, timing of first meetings, and then the structure of committees underneath as well. So if you're expecting to be able to make announcements quite soon, can you just at least give us some an indication of months? I mean, are you expecting something this month? Are you expecting next month? Are you expecting before Christmas? Can you just be a bit more precise?
I mean,
in the very near future, in the next few weeks, we'll be making some announcements on membership,
the date of the first meeting. Obviously then we'll have to, and then as I said, committees that sit beneath the board. We're also working hard in terms of our own internal governance structure in MOPAC and the governance boards that we have, such as the London Crime Reduction Board and the various other boards, to make sure that they fit within that structure, and we've not just placed the London Policing Board on top of everything else that we already do, because it's a significant step up in oversight, it's a significant step up in time and in resources that is needed as well.
And the terms of reference for the board, have those been drafted and agreed?
They are being drafted at the moment. Of course, the terms of reference for the board, as we all know, will be, in terms of the structure of board meetings, that will be agreed by the chair at the first meeting of the London Policing Board.
And who's been involved in the process of drafting those terms of reference?
MOPAC, the Mayor's office. We are discussing that with the Commissioner and his office as well. And then, of course, as we appoint members to the board, we'll be discussing those terms of reference with them, so that when we get to the board, hopefully we will just be able to agree them.
And have you thought about engaging with this committee in terms of what you're proposing and planning?
Very happy to have a conversation with you as chair and as you wish around the terms of reference once we've got a draft that we're happy with.
That would be very good if we can get that meeting into our diaries. So Mark, did you want to come in on this issue?
No, thank you. Yes, so I think more sort of transparency, public scrutiny is really important, and I support the recommendation, and that's look forward to the policing board getting established. Something I just wanted to flag up, that is this potentially adds quite a big change in the landscape of governance, and that's intended, and the Deputy Mayor has made the point about significant time and resources, and it's going to, I think, cause us to reflect on the balance of engagement with this committee. If we have, for example, more than monthly public meetings that myself and other members of the top team are serving for the policing board and associated committees, then we need to reflect on that balance of effort there, where we have a legal duty to be held to account by the Deputy Mayor and the Mayor, compared to here. Now, clearly there's a long history of working with the PCC, and I think certain components like the annual plenary or the thematic work you do, where our sort of experts come along to those, I think there's no reason those should change. But I do question the amount of these appearances in terms of the Q&A sessions, if we're doing an awful lot of Q&A sessions within the policing board. And so we're going to need to look at that balance as we see the final details of the frequency of meetings, etc. But it may well end up in fewer of these appearances from myself and the senior team.
We're obviously not going to get into the detail of working this out in this meeting, but I think it's fair to say that this committee has always appreciated the input from you and your predecessors in the process of democratic scrutiny of policing in London. And we are elected as Assembly members to represent Londoners, and at this particular time, when there is so much concern about the issues raised in the Casey review and the work that you are doing to address those issues, that accountability and that elected accountability is something that we think is very important, and we think it's important to Londoners. So I think that needs to be part of the conversation as we take this forward. I'm sure I know a couple of my fellow Assembly members want to come in.
Can I just come in on the back of that?
Yes.
Do you mind, Chair? So I agree that sort of transparency and accountability is absolutely critical. You will understand, for me and my senior team, we've got to balance time between attending meetings like this and being held to account and actually running the organisation. If we're adding a new big piece of accountability into the ecosystem, that must cause a sort of reflection on the balance. And of course, Parliament has decided that my accountability is completely to the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor legally, not to this group, and that's the legal frame created for right or wrong. We've engaged well with this group over sort of a dozen years or so, particularly in the absence of both under Boris Johnson and under the current mayor. There's been very little public scrutiny of policing. That's going to change quite dramatically, and I'm simply flagging up out of courtesy. We need to therefore rebalance our time. The degree of that rebalancing depends on the final detail of plans, and we'll keep having conversations about it.
Well, I think, yes, we are very keen to keep that conversation going. I'm going to bring in Assemblymember Hall, then Assemblymember Pidgeon, and then Assemblymember Duval.
Thank you. Good morning, both. So transparency and accountability, we all agree, is very, very important. So how are the members of the policing board actually chosen, Deputy Mayor?
We have been out to open recruitment and advertisement. We've had a recruitment consultant helping us with that. They have been chosen in the normal way of a job would be chosen, or a non-executive director post has been chosen. There's been a proper sift of candidates, and there have been interviews as well.
Yeah. So who does the sift, and who's got the final say?
The sift was originally done. I think we had over 300 applicants for the London Policing Board, which shows the level of interest in it, and that's to be welcomed. The original sift was done by Gayton B. Sanderson, who are the recruitment consultants, and then the shortlisting was done by a panel, and then the final, obviously it's the Mayor's Policing Board. We recommended, in terms of post-interview, candidates for appointment, and the Mayor is confirming appointments at the moment.
So ultimately the Mayor is choosing who is on his policing board.
After sifting a process of skills, assessment of skills, after proper interviews, and then there's recommendations going up. Yeah.
Yes, no, I hear what you say. I'm concerned that the Mayor is choosing the members of the policing board that are actually going to scrutinise the Metropolitan Police, for which he is the Police and Crime Commissioner. Does that not seem a little bit bizarre to you? Because let me tell you, the Mayor would not probably choose certainly the people on this side of the argument, if you like to put it that way. And I hope that the Commissioner finds that we are scrutinising properly. But I find it bizarre that the Mayor is choosing the people that are going to scrutinise him, because I take it he is chairing, is he? Is he going to chair?
Of course, the Mayor is chairing his own London Policing Board,
as well as choosing the members on it.
I actually find it. I don't agree with you at all about how this is unusual for a chair to be deciding who the members of their board are. After an open recruitment basis, skills-based assessment and interviews. I don't find that unusual. I think you should wait and see before you decide and cast judgment on who the Mayor has chosen and who has come through this process, before you decide whether it is right or wrong, and whether you think the policing board is sufficiently robust, sufficiently representative of London, and sufficiently, has the skills, and that's the important bit, isn't it? The skills in order to carry out the oversight that's needed through the London Policing Board, and to be able to advise the Mayor on his statutory duties.
I repeat, if you're looking for transparency and accountability, I find it very strange that the Mayor of London is going to choose or be allowed to veto, if you like, the people that are on the policing board that are actually going to be scrutinising the Metropolitan Police, for which he is the Police and Crime Commissioner. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Pidgeon.
Yeah, thank you. Deputy Mayor, I'm still not clear, and I'd hope by now we would be clearer on the exact role the policing board is going to be playing and how it fits with all the other boards, which you started to mention some of them earlier, and, as we said before, how it fits alongside the Police and Crime Committee. Are you able to share some of the early thinking on this so that we can actually have an input onto that? But also, you said you're looking to not duplicate, to get rid of some of your existing boards perhaps, and so on, so this doesn't create this huge additional piece of work. Presumably that means that the officers such as Sir Mark won't have to attend some of those existing meetings. Actually, the balance overall may well be similar to what it is now.
So there's a number of questions in that. In terms of the role of the London Policing Board, I'm very clear about the role of the London Policing Board. It is there to support and advise the Mayor carry out his statutory duties as the Police and Crime Commissioner for London, and that is what, very, very clear about that. And in terms of the in terms of the recruitment, we have been really trying to ensure that we have a real cross-section of skills, a cross-section of experiences, and the talent that is needed to go on the London Policing Board in order to be able to help the Mayor carry out his statutory functions. In terms of the your question about other boards and other meetings, you are right. Of course, we're not just trying to place the London Policing Board on top of everything. I think the significant differences the Commissioner's talked about is that this is going to be in public, and that is a significant difference. So, this is where I chair an oversight board at the moment. They will not continue because we have the London Policing Board. So you're right. There will be. There will be some meetings coming out of the diary. We will still have those governance boards as well, but we are looking to see whether any of them can be streamlined. But it's mostly about the oversight functions and the meetings that I chair that will come out of the diary. However, what is going in the diary are public meetings and public accountability and transparency. And I do understand where the Commissioner's coming from in terms of looking at some of that balance as to the pressure on time and resources.
Okay, and can you just clarify, just listening to your answer to my colleague earlier, who sat on the assessment panel and carried out the interviews?
I sat on the assessment panel, the Deputy Mayor for Communities and Skills, Debbie Weeks-Bernard, and the Chief of Staff, David Bellamy.
Oh, and David Bellamy. Okay, interesting. No officer from MOPAC?
Well, we had officer support, but we were the decision makers, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And are you still looking to stick to appoint to 9, I think it was?
We've always said we will look to appoint between 9 and 12 members of the London Policing Board, and there will also be ex officio members of the London Policing Board, which means people who...
London councils, you mean? Yeah,
absolutely, London councils, but also, some of the... myself, for example, would be an ex officio member, so there will be others who are there because of their position.
Lovely. Well, I think we look forward to getting a meeting to start discussing how all this works going forward, and look forward to getting an agreement as we've had previously. Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly Member Pigeon. Assembly Member Duval.
It's unfortunate at this stage that we haven't got some of that detail in front of us. So maybe you could just help a little bit. The balance between the policing board, between community representatives, which I think you've spoken about in previous committees, and technical capacity, given where we were in terms of some of the crisis that the MPS face around that. What does it look like then? Can you just tell us that between technical stroke and community representation?
We have sought to make sure there's a good balance between that technical skills and expertise and community representation and lived experience. I hope that when we finalise the confirmation process and we've got everything in order, you will see that we have achieved that. But of course, that's one of the questions that we ask people at interview. That's just one person, and it's between 9 and 12 people on a board, and they cannot represent the whole of London and the diversity of London. So the other thing that we are working through at the moment is how do we ensure that the voice of young people is there, the voice of diverse communities who may not see themselves on the board are there, and how do we ensure that the mechanisms that we already have through City Hall, whether it be the community engagement from MOPAC, the VRU's Young Person Action Group, or the community, engagement teams within the Communities Directorate of City Hall, how do we ensure that that is fed through and that board members are able to use that capacity, use that expertise, and also the role of board members in engaging with communities as well. We're working that through at the moment.
So it's a laudable aim that you say about wanting to create transparency and in decision making, but what decision making powers are the police board going to have? And then take us through the rest of the infrastructure. So I'm quite interested now in terms of just picking up about the crime and disorder partnership, because that's, there is both technical and political there. It has a very different role than maybe widening out some aspects of maybe what a police authority was. And then we go back to Casey, which started off with Casey wanted to establish a policing board to deal with the immediate crises as she'd identified those. On top of that, I think the MPS said, hold on, we've also got what the inspectorate uncovered and some of those issues. And now we're widening it out to, that's obviously got to be a priority, but something bigger and wider, because bringing in MOPAC into your internal mechanisms of scrutiny and bringing those with the partnership bodies and then bringing the police authority to it, how does that all work then? You know, I mean, it does, you know, if we're a matter of weeks away, it would be nice to have had some detail in front of us.
I understand. I do understand that, and of course, as soon as we've absolutely got that pinned down, we will let you have that, and we will be, you know, very happy to discuss that either at Police and Crime Committee or at a separate meeting, or both, whichever you want. I mean, I've said already today, and I think I said at the last Police and Crime Committee, the board is an advisory board. It isn't a decision-making board, and obviously the powers lay with the mayor, who delegates those powers down to nearly everything down to me in terms of that decision-making. So there will still be that decision-making. The final decision will be my decision, but through advice and support from the board. And we are working through how that works, because I chair a monthly, for example, I chair a monthly investment advisory meeting, which is around the contracts and procurement that the Met needs to undertake, and that's a monthly meeting because of the volume of contracts that such a large organisation as the Metropolitan Police has. Clearly, quarterly meetings, the London Policing Board, we still need to find that rhythm, but there still also needs to be the public accountability and transparency. So I can foresee the IAM continuing, but actually we need to think about, well, what needs to come to the London Policing Board, and how do they have a strategic view of the decision-making, the principles about the decision-making, and you know, the strategy behind it. But that's not the only thing the London Policing Board is meant to be will bring transparency and accountability to. It's not just about the decision-making, it's also about the performance of the Metropolitan Police, oversight of the performance of the Metropolitan Police, and oversight of the strategies of the Metropolitan Police, and then, and this is the performance part of it, the impact that those strategies have. So it's a dual, it's not just about the transparency around decision-making, it really is about that oversight around performance and effectiveness, and the duties that the Mayor has in terms of Police and Crime Commissioner. You ask about the other boards, and I think you're referring to the London Crime Reduction Board. We've clearly got to look at the governance structure that we have and the boards that we have within MOPAC, and we are discussing that at the moment. We have a number of boards, such as the Violence Against Women and Girls Board, which obviously will continue. The London Crime Reduction Board has been a dual-purpose board in terms of actually the way in which it has operated, sort of half oversight, half partnership, and we are looking at the moment as that the oversight clearly will go to the London Policing Board, and it will have London Council representation on it. And where does the partnership, what bits of the partnership may be able to go to other boards? We're discussing that at the moment.
Okay, Commissioner, coming to your point, I mean, initially, because it's the first time I've heard of you in terms of from your own mouth in terms of what your thinking is, I am slightly concerned, and I do, you know, and I wouldn't, so my knee-jerk reaction until we see some detail and follow it through is that it's one of short-sightedness, I think. I mean, I'm aware of the pressures that are faced by you, but I'm hopeful that in negotiations that you would want to see the value of maintaining a presence here in terms of this scrutiny body, because it's underlined by statutory. We're very grateful for your attendance, and we know that's not undermined. And I'm pleased to hear about what you said about the Mayor and, you know, in terms of Police and Crime Commissioner and your accountability towards him. But, you know, I do, you know, there are issues, you know, let's not kid ourselves. You've also got a dotted line, if I can call it that, to the Home Secretary and some of those issues. So I'm aware of the pressures. But do you really feel that you really want to completely switch that focus away from London's democratic scrutiny body in terms of police and crime, underpinned by statutory arrangements, as an external third eye? And given some of the work that we've done over the years as a critical friend to you and to the police service, a bit of tough love, I admit. It's not been pleasant sometimes, I imagine. And likewise, you're right to come back and be critical of the committee when we may get it wrong or we're not in full possession of the facts. But over the years, I've had previous commissioners say they valued some of the questioning that have been raised by this body. And I do not understand or fathom out why you would want to go down this road at this immediate time and not see how it pans out and see the rest of the picture. Now, you're in a better position than I am at the moment because I'm not seeing anything about some of the infrastructure around those issues. So, in that sense of the part of the conversation that should be had, a mature conversation about those issues, whatever you may have come to a view on or whatever, I hope you're keeping an open mind.
Definitely keep an open mind. I think you've known me here for 6 years as Assistant Commissioner and a little while ago and now as Commissioner for a year. In fact, I think some of you are involved in my appointment as an Assistant Commissioner when you were the Police Authority. I think the relationship is really important. I think you will always have found me to be sort of transparent and open and as helpful as I possibly can be. That's because public accountability and that transparency really, really matters to me. I'm just being completely candid that depending on the issues of potentially a large extra volume of public accountability being dropped onto the landscape, that potentially creates a rebalancing. And that, as I said at the start, there's a sort of how far that rebalancing goes depends on the detail that MOPAC and the Mayor's Office are finalising and conversations we can have. But you want me to, and I think the public want me to, work with my senior team to help the Met do the best job it possibly can do for the communities of London. And there's a balance in our time that if we spend too much time being scrutinised and not enough time doing, that gets out of kilter. And public meetings are a lot more than a 2-hour meeting. There's an awful lot of prep and background to it, and I just need to be pragmatic about that. The devil will be in the detail, but I'm just being completely candid that me and my team can't sustain a large amount of extra public scrutiny being added and nothing subtracted. That's the challenge.
Assembly Member Duval, are you finished? Thank you. Reassuring to hear you say that public accountability matters to you, and I hope that underpins our conversations about this as we take this forward, but I think we've probably covered this enough in this particular meeting. Now, before we move on to the next section of questions, Commissioner, I just briefly wanted you to give us an update on the data breach from the 26th of August. There's been concern raised about the sort of dangers of outsourcing operationally sensitive material to third parties, and I understand that the Sun reported that in some cases the hackers may have been able to access home addresses, and I just wondered if you could give us an update just on the mitigations you've put in place and the sort of just the broad picture about this data breach.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to speak about this. It is deeply concerning. I am very happy to brief committee members more fully outside of here, but there is a live investigation, and if anyone here has sort of experience in ransomware attacks, etc., then talking in detail about a live case publicly doesn't work very well. And I sort of, having said I'm open to public scrutiny, that sounds a bit in conflict with that, doesn't it? So I'm happy to brief behind the scenes. If you wanted a fuller conversation in confidence, we could set up a call in the next few days to do that. Just to put the headlines there, though, there is data to do with our creating of our security passes, which doesn't necessarily compromise the physical security of buildings, but the personal data in doing that is some personal data of majority of people in the organisation and some other people with passes to the Metropolitan Police. In most cases, that data is not going to create extra risk or concern to individuals, but in some cases it definitely will do, and we're working through every individual case and working with those individuals. So that's the sort of the core of the centre of the issue. I think in terms of your point sort of raised an implicit question about outsourcing. Outsourcing isn't bad in and of itself, because we shouldn't pretend that we can be the best at everything. We're a police organisation. That said, once you're involved in a relationship where another organisation has access to sensitive data, and organisations and government organisations with more sensitive data work with other sectors as well, so we're not unique in this. It's not wrong in principle, but the rule set that you create in your commercial arrangements, how you monitor and test that, the due diligence through contract management, all of that is absolutely critical. So how can you be confident that that you're setting the right standards, they're meeting them, and you're following through on it? That's the critical issue. So at the moment, there are 3 strands of work ongoing. In relation to the narrowness of this incident, there's 2 pieces of work. Strand A is the initial consequence management that we are doing in terms of understanding the detail of the data breach, what that means to individuals, and working with individuals and any concerns they have. And so dealing with all of that consequential issue. That is tied in with the National Crime Agency, who are leading on the investigation. So that's strand 1. Strand 2 is we are investigating the history of this contract, how it was let, how it's been managed, to understand in that what we've got right, what we may have got wrong, sort of what we can learn from that, and whether there's any sort of culpability in that. So there's things to be worked through in that. So those are specific to this. Strand 3 is a wider piece of review work to look at all of our contracts that involve data, sensitive data being held outside the Met's data estate, and reviewing those, looking at both the sort of commercial and technical arrangements. That's a bigger piece of work, as you would understand, and we're bringing in some outside expertise to help do that. So we're not sort of just marking our own homework. Sort of, we need some different experts to our experts who've created these arrangements to have a look at it, and that will take that sort of work will start in the next few weeks, and that will take sort of quite a period of time to work its way through. So that's the longer term learning from this. But there's the 2 pieces around consequence and the contractual letting on this piece, on this breach, and then there's the wider review work.
In terms of the immediate work,
yes.
In terms of the sort of mitigations and the sort of looking at this immediate contract, do you have a timescale for being able to actually report publicly on that?
We will, in terms of the initial investigation, we will be able to report publicly in terms of our review of the contract and what we've learnt from it at a high level. Certainly, I think that'll be in a small number of weeks. I haven't got an exact timeline in my mind. We're doing it as fast as we possibly can do. In terms of the detail of the data breach, again, in that sort of timescale, we will update publicly. But I think, sort of, given the nature of the investigation issues, we'll never put all the details publicly. But again, confidentially, have to brief members of the committee behind the scenes subsequently.
Thank you. Well, we will certainly take you up on the offer of that briefing. Members, we are up against it in terms of time, so we need to be speedy and quick. I think Assembly Member Prince, you were going to ask the next question.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Commissioner, do you welcome the government's commitment to pursue all reasonable lines of inquiry, and does the Met have the resources and expertise to deliver this?
So I think the principle of reasonable lines of inquiry is a reasonable one, and it's not something that's unfamiliar to us. There is a capacity issue. But in principle, every victim deserves a sort of opportunity that we will do what is reasonable to solve that case. I mean, reasonable depends on the situation, it depends on the solvability of the case, it depends on the gravity of the case, it depends on resource issues around it. So it is something that I want to be able to achieve on behalf of victims. It links into some of what we'll talk about later in terms of reform, so creating extra capacity in the system. So, for example, the work we're doing to implement Right Care, Right Person, which is the change in approach to mental health over the next couple of months, will give us some extra capacity, which will lead to fuller investigations on more cases as a consequence of that. Looking at innovative use of technologies to find more rapid routes to solve cases is another sort of example of how we can become more efficient and more effective, and sort of things like facial recognition and other technologies are helpful in that space. So looking for ways to get more efficient and more able to do more thorough investigations on a bigger percentage of cases is critical to our reforms. But there's a lot behind the word reasonable.
Do you have a target on how long it takes to do an investigation at all? Do you have what would seem reasonable to resolve an investigation?
It varies across investigations. So, I mean, a complex investigation can take months and years. A straightforward case can be done in sort of a few days. If there's a high risk case where someone is someone's in custody and you're trying to get to charge, you're going to get as much of it done as possible in the sort of first few hours. So it varies across the investigation.
But you don't have any targets or?
No, and we monitor it, but there's such a wide variety of cases that a target is too sort of arbitrary.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, one of the emerging issues, and really that trumps all other problems that the MPS face, is the recruitment stroke attritional rates.
Yes.
And if the trend's up and there, it's game over for some of the things you've identified and that you want to achieve. So where are we? So is the first police authority going to receive a report on that issue, which would be interesting to see what the agenda looks like?
Yeah.
Where are you on that thinking? And can you also write and share your thoughts about the approach in the short term and the long term in dealing with this issue that's coming up? Because I think we're in difficulties now. We emerge into crisis if it continues, probably within a year in some of your services.
I'm not sure I'd use the word crisis, but I am very worried about recruitment. I think that's fair to say. I think it's a complex picture in London, and there are many other public services struggling to recruit in London. So it's not just a Metropolitan Police issue. But just to give some headline numbers, we started this sort of financial year, so sort of 1st of April, 1,000 officers short of our target. So it's sort of rounding numbers. Our target is around 35,000 officers, and we started 1,000 light of that. Our attrition and recruitment are not even in balance, so we're going backwards. That is more about recruitment problems than it is about attrition. So our attrition numbers are frankly a little lower than we thought they might be, and they're certainly in line with other pictures nationally. So the proportion of officers leaving in a year is not disproportionately high at this stage, but recruiting is difficult. I think there's probably a combination, it's really hard to see, probably a combination of sort of cost of living and issues in London. Frankly, we've recruited over 9,000 officers in 3 years, so I think there may be something about what's in the market in terms of people who policing is a career that appeals to them. There's those wider public sector issues, and the reputational issues that we're facing will be a part of it as well. So I think the combination of factors that are playing into that. We're currently projecting that at the end of the year, based on the sort of net effect of sort of recruiting and losses, that being 1,000 officers in deficit could rise to sort of 1,500 or a little bit more in terms of deficit. That's our concern. In terms of recruiting police staff, we are being more successful. We are sort of holding our own on that. For example, I'll perhaps be talking about call handling performance later. We've been strengthening our approach in call handling, and recruiting people in that area has been going well. So general police staff recruitment is going fine. You'll be aware that as part of our budget this year, the Mayor has put the money in for an extra 500 PCSOs, because we're 1,600 fewer PCSOs than we were a decade ago. And Mayor and I share enthusiasm to rebuild that, and the first 500 is the money's in the system. Our recruiting of those is going fairly well, so we're increasing numbers. But in terms of what we're going to achieve this year, it may be more in the sort of 200 or so uplift rather than the full 500. But at least we are showing the ability to grow the numbers, even if it's going to take us slightly longer than intended. So there's a mixed recruitment picture, but at the centre of it, if we can't get our officer numbers, that's a big concern. I'm really disappointed that government policy means that the approximately 60 million funding for the 1,000 officers that we didn't recruit is withdrawn. I could use that 60 million very effectively in growing police staff numbers to free police officers up to go onto the streets. We have the smallest proportion of police staff in the organisation of any police force in the country. And something I've been concerned about from day one, and Louise Casey confirms, is we've got police officers effectively ending up doing support functions, human resource functions and things like that, because we don't have enough police staff. So actually spending that money on probably 11 or 1,200 police staff rather than 1,000 police officers, I could have a big effect on getting officers onto the front line, but at the moment that money's withheld, and we're in conversations with the Home Office about that.
And if you could, in that written response to us, also include that and map out what you think we could be doing to raise that flexibility. But it does beg the question. I'm very supportive of police warranted officers. I think it's important. I understand
Absolutely.
Around that. And I don't see it undermining, but shouldn't we start looking in different parts of the service, mixed teams of crime fighters, both warranted and non-warranted police officers? It's worked well in different crises. When we had a detective crisis around that we brought people in, is there something more strategic that we can make sense in terms of policing and future of policing when we're facing some of these difficulties?
I think that's a very it's a very shrewd question. I think our approach to workforce isn't as sophisticated as it needs to be to beat the challenges of policing today. Sort of issues around specialist skills, around cyber and technology and all the sorts of things you'd expect. There's a different mix of skills required, which are a slightly simplistic view of, well, police officers largely do operational stuff and police staff do support work, is out of date. Of course, there are already exceptions to that. We have our forensics department is entirely police staff, and that's operational. PCSOs are operational, our call handlers are operational, but I think there's a changing balance and mix required, and candidly, over a decade or two, police chiefs and politicians from all parties have been attracted to headlines about police officer numbers, and I've taken part in that sometimes, as most people around the table have, and there's lots to attract to that. But I think we need a changing debate that says what's the right workforce to have the best effect for the public, and the current debate sort of doesn't quite get us there exactly as you illustrate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I can't let you go without asking you how your injured officers are after the Notting Hill Carnival. There were so many of them. Can you update us on their condition?
Yeah. So fortunately, there's 69 police officers injured. None of them were so serious. I don't have exact figures. I think pretty much all of them are back at work. I can get you an update on that. I think the important thing to say about Notting Hill is I think we need to be really careful about what the issues are and what the issues aren't. It's an event of over 1 million people, and hundreds, and the vast majority have a fantastic time. It's a very special event in sort of London's calendar. The crime reported associated with it is not disproportionate to other big events in terms of size. I mean, frankly, if you took some of the sort of more difficult football matches pro rata, the arrests and crime numbers are not that different. The thing that is different is the severity of those crimes. So it's not about the volume of crime, which I think some clumsy public commentary can suggest, because there's hundreds of thousands of people having a fantastic time. But the severity of crime, where we have 9 stabbings, 1 was very, very close to being a murder. It's miraculous that the young man's life was saved. The degree of, I think we sort of, the number of weapons recovered, 71 knives recovered, 1 or 2 firearms, sort of as part of the operations associated with it. I think these are matters of sort of real concern to me, not to mention the assaults on police officers. So the severity of some of the crime associated with it, and secondly, the risk of crushing, and some of the crowd management needs to strengthen. Now, this isn't a police event; it's a community event organised by Notting Hill Carnival Limited, with support from local authorities and others. And as part of the review work going forward, we need to look at how do we keep it as a special event but mitigate those very clear risks that we can see from a policing perspective, and there may be other issues that communities and local authorities and organisers want to tackle, but from a policing perspective, those are the 2 things that concern me, is that proportionate amount of crime, but that is so acute that is really concerning, and secondly, the risk of crushing. And as we work that through our reviews and work with the organisers, we'll be looking with them at what's a sensible list of mitigations that can deal with those issues and retain it as a special event.
Thank you, and I'll just take this moment to thank the officers on the ground who showed Assemblymember Desai. Assemblymember Ahmed, did you visit Notting Hill? No, and Assemblymember Davenish and I on the Monday, and they all did an amazing job showing us around, so thank you very much for that. Assemblymember Cooper, I'm bringing you in now, and this is moving us on to look at the Casey Review and the new Met for London plan.
Not quite, because I just had something else I wanted to ask about. Thank you. Commissioner, you will have know that the Home Secretary has just announced a probe by the HMIC FRS into, I think, what has been described as police impartiality and activism. And I wondered if it was your perception that that is a big issue currently in the Met?
I mean, it's the Home Secretary to announce probes as she sees fit. I'm very clear that our job is to operate without fear or favour, and that's what we will always do. Whether that's about investigating crime, policing protest, how we present ourselves publicly, we have to almost more than any other profession work hard at that neutrality, and that means being independent of any cause, whether that is a cause which has 99% public support or 1% public support, and that's what we'll do on my watch.
In addition, I believe that she was talking about woke police damaging public trust, and yet at the same time we've seen the Casey report saying almost the opposite, if you like, that there's been racism in the police. Do you believe that there are a lot of woke police who are damaging public trust in London?
It's not a word I use. I think it's for politicians to hold me to account rather than for me to comment on sort of political debate.
OK, I'm going to ask the same questions to Sophie Linden, then, the Deputy Mayor. Do you believe there's lots of woke police infesting the Met? And what do you think about this police impartiality and activism claim? Do you think these are problems for us?
No, I think there are far more important problems that the HMIC FRS should be looking at in policing nationally. The drop in detections, the inability to bring a lot of offenders to justice, Sexual offences, I know you're going to go into some of the issues around Met reform. There are so many more important issues that are pressing that are really impacting on trust and confidence that I think this is politically motivated, which is a bit of a sort of it's a bit of a conundrum, isn't it? To instigate an inquiry and inspection into politically motivated policing, which is politically motivated in itself. And I do think I totally support the Commission. What we need and what we have to the vast majority is absolutely committed officers within the Met who operate without fear or favour.
Which brings me on to the much more substantive point, which is about the case review and the new Met for London, which is the area I think we'd all prefer to focus on rather than the kind of stuff that I was just raising. To what extent, Deputy Mayor, has MOPAC been involved in the rollout of a new Met for London, and what impact do you think that it's going to have on delivery of the Mayor's police and crime plan?
So, one of the, we've already discussed the London Policing Board, but one of the big elements of the work that MOPAC's been doing is how the London Policing Board will ensure that there is sufficient oversight, public accountability and transparency around the impact that the new Met for London plan is having. I think the new Met for London plan is a really comprehensive plan in terms of setting out the Commissioner's vision and the Commissioner's policies and milestones, really clear milestones within it, as to how the Met will be reformed and improve its service to Londoners, but also improve the way in which it treats its own officers and improve the way in which it raises standards and ensures that the right officers are within the Met, and look at the systemic structural issues that have been highlighted by the Casey review. The MOPAC has been worked closely with the Metropolitan Police in the development of the new Met for London plan, and as we did across City Hall as well, we brought in colleagues from across City Hall to ensure that expertise that we have is able to support the Commissioner and his team as they develop the new Met for London plan. And we're really pleased to see the influence of that, and we support that, and we will continue to work with the Commissioner and his team in terms of the delivery of that plan. So, for example, strongest ever neighbourhood policing, what does that look like? What can we do to ensure that neighbourhood policing is obviously these are operational decisions for the Commissioner in terms of the deployment of resources, but there is that engagement with communities, and how do we ensure that is there? So MOPAC will continue to do that, but we'll continue to do that across City Hall as well.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to pass straight on to another colleague.
Thank you, and this is now for Assembly Member Devonish.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, good morning. I want to include my comments in terms of I agree with my colleagues on Notting Hill Carnival, and thank you for the job that you guys always do. My question, though, is what are the key messages from Londoners at a new for Met London Borough event, which I attended one of them during the summer, and what action is the Met taking in response, please?
Yeah, so I think the events, I was in Camden last night. We're doing, I don't think this hasn't been done before, 32 events in 8 weeks. I'm really clear that if we're recentering policing based on communities, that I was determined we would launch the plan in every borough in London rather than by me doing a speech in Whitehall. That's much more important, and time limits me from doing all the events, but by the time I go to Croydon on Friday, I've done 14, so I've done nearly half the boroughs myself, and Lynn and the rest of the team have picked up the others. The plan came out of a combination of our own analysis, recommendations from the Inspectorate, recommendations from City Hall, and reflections from their feedback, and of course the case report, all crunched together in that plan, on top of more than 10,000 public contacts in terms of our draft that we put out in January. And so it's pretty comprehensive. There's been a lot of people feed into it. The message has been, without doing the sort of 12-minute sort of opening I do, the message has been, we are going to deliver more trust, less crime, high standards, recognising that trust and crime are the key outcomes of policing. It's not just about crime, you have to build trust, is point one. And point two is, it's sad to be a commissioner who has to put standards on the top line, but because we've slipped up, I have to do that to be seen to tackle it and be seen to tackle it. we recognise that we're some way from that, and Casey and all the recent reports and examples illustrate that. And the plan basically has two themes in it. How do we assess progress against trust, crime and standards, and what does the outcome look like? So picking up the neighbourhoods example, it's actually about a strong, visible neighbourhood team in your area that have good relationship with local communities, so they understand the crime and disorder issues that are worrying them and are tackling them, working with them and local authorities and others, as one example. So what does the outcome look like? And the second thing is, given that's not what we're doing now, what are the changes that we need to make? And it summarises the changes. There's a big detailed plan. There's a lot to do across three areas. There's foundational issues we need to fix around issues like training, equipment, facilities. There's cultural issues we need to fix, which we're going to come to later, about both sorting out the sort of hundreds who shouldn't be in the organisation, as well as building the healthiest possible culture for the tens of thousands of fantastic people. And then the third theme is about community crime fighting, that tilt back towards working with communities. So how do we fight crime working with communities and other partners rather than in isolation? And it talks about neighbour policing, violence against women and girls, targeting offenders and those issues. So that's the themes in it. That's my sort of 60-second version of what I do in 12 minutes, but it's a sort of 40-page document with a lot behind it.
Obviously, I welcome the events, and the one I went to was very good. I do have to say one thing, which the feedback I got from most people I spoke to was, it's all good words, but clearly it is about the actions that follow. You know, even last week, the figures I just had, again, in the London Evening Standard, between January and August, just take knife crime, stabbings have gone up by 5.3%. 2,290 people were stabbed between January and August. And that's what people, and I had that from people across the political spectrum at the events I went to. Those are the kind of things people want to obviously see change.
Yeah, so knife crime is still below what it was pre-COVID, and it has gone up slightly this year, and we're doing everything we can about that. We can talk more about other areas, but we're keeping homicide at sort of the lowest level it's been for many, many years. We've got burglaries, I think, about a third below what it was before COVID, and it's down a handful of percent this year. We've more than doubled our detections of rapes, and we've gone from being in the bottom quarter in the country to being in the top quarter in terms of solving rapes. So there's many things we can talk to in terms of positive progress, but there are issues. We've got to keep an eye on that sort of rise in violence, and sort of my biggest operational concern, you've seen us talk about it publicly, is street robbery and theft from person, particularly mobile phones, but other issues where we are high compared to other cities, and we've started to make progress in the last couple of months in reducing that, but we've got a long way to go.
I'll leave it there, Chair, but I'm hoping we'll see far more of the Commissioner and not just the Policing Board. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I bring in Assembly Member Pidgeon?
Thank you. Obviously, it's welcome that you're going around all the boroughs, and I'm not sure how many more you and the team have to cover. But have you changed the structure of the meetings following feedback and from them? Because what I've picked up from people is that instead of saying this is the plan that you're setting out, and then in workshops sort of going through how that might be implemented in the borough, perhaps by different themes or whatever, you know, people are put into groups, they can't hear each other, it's very noisy. The questions are generic things like, what changes do you want to see from the Met, rather than how can we implement this in the borough? What are we doing? So I'm just wondering, the details of the plan aren't really being discussed in the way that perhaps many people might like. Have you changed how you've gone about it throughout the series? And if not, is there therefore an opportunity going forward for the Met or MOPAC with the Met to be looking at some further community engagement to really ensure this kind of embedded and informed from the community as well as from what you have developed?
So it's interesting you've got that feedback. The team have done sort of post-event surveys with people who've attended, and the vast majority have found them sort of helpful. I think it's maybe 2/3 roughly who are find it extremely or very helpful, and the remainder find it quite helpful. So I think generally it's positive. I think In the first half of the events, there was some slightly variety of formats, and we've tidied that up based on the format that worked. It's the start of a process. We've said there will be local events on a sort of quarterly basis, not all of this scale, and not all with senior team coming out to them, but that's the intent. One event isn't going to change relationships, and I think I see as I go around London the sort of different levels of maturity in relationships that are there. The better events have managed to get significant numbers of young people there who have a particular experience of policing crime, which is fantastic, but we haven't managed that at all events. One or two of the early events didn't manage to get beyond people who already talk to police a lot, but the more recent events have had sort of the majority of people have been, if you like, normal members of the public rather than politicians or regular advisors. Not that you're not all normal members of the public, clearly.
Wow.
So I think getting that sort of
describe us as normal.
getting that sort of reach, I think, has been really important, and we've worked harder and harder that through it. But I think the feedback has been more positive than that, and I think it generates the next stages and follow-ups of conversations with third sector organisations, with particular community groups, people who want to work with us, that sort of I see those spinning out of those conversations. And we have a small but significant number of community police officers and local leaders in the room as well from the policing team, and that gives them that opportunity as well. So I think it's having the right trigger effect, but it's the start of centering policing around the local. I think just to capture the spirit of what I'm trying to get here, the question I asked, so like in Camden last night, who makes decisions on, how do we make decisions on the policing of Camden? Should it all come from Scotland Yard? And the answer is clearly no. But I think too much has come from Scotland Yard, so to speak. For me, it's the balance, because the local community sees things and has a feel for the local issues, which will be more nuanced and better in many respects than what we can see. But there will be some issues around organised crime and knife crime, etc., and people moving firearms around, where probably the police have a better view of what's going on than some in the local community. So rather than it being tipped very much to top down, we're trying to find a different balance where the sort of community feed in to the policing that takes place in their borough or their neighbourhood has a bigger part of the balance alongside what we can see as professional police officers. And we're trying to tip that. That's quite a difficult thing to do. That's why we've put stronger local leadership in place. You've got the new superintendents in each borough, and that's why we're building this different approach. It'll take time. But I mean, the thing that's been most powerful to me, and this is, as someone who's lived in London for 25 years, sometimes it's helpful to remind it of the bleeding obvious. It's very obvious when you go around so many boroughs in quick succession, the degree of difference between them, and tipping that balance is really important. Well, I mean, you go to some of the outer boroughs, some of the inner boroughs are different, but then the inner boroughs are different to each other, and the outer boroughs are different from each other, and sort of capturing that, I think, is really important, and creating a frame where the Met can work together. But what actually gets done in policing is influenced locally as well as centrally, I think, is really important. And that's what we're trying to achieve.
I think that's reassuring to hear, and that this is the start, and the idea of some sort of quarterly events with the local team. I think that will be where some of this more local discussion can take place. Yes. And I really welcome that and hope that does happen. You touched on young people, which I wanted to ask about. You say young people have been attending some of the perhaps later meetings where they've had more time to organise. Have you got any other examples of how you're engaging with young people to reform the service, and also if you've got any evidence yet on the impact this is having on young people's perceptions of the Met?
I think it's been positive with the people there. It's a small subset. So I think something that comes out of the events is conversations with sort of people from local communities are practical conversations. They ask about issues like antisocial behaviour, our response to day-to-day crime issues, knife crime. So it's practical policing issues peppered with questions and concerns about how we operate on things like stop and search, and given these high-profile cases, can I trust you if my daughter is a victim of crime? All those sort of things you'd expect to come out in the raw, and that's really positive. So just to pick the stop and search example, one piece of work that we're doing, which is a Casey recommendation, is a stop and search charter. So, okay, we have legal requirements in terms of how we do stop and search, but going beyond that in terms of the training, the oversight, the and sort of how we think about safeguarding and other issues around stop and search. And that's a consultation process that's going on at the moment, that before the end of the year we'll have that charter that's been very much bottom up, and a lot of that consultation involvement is with young people, because they're the people who frankly experience stop and search. So there's a practical example of diving into one narrow but really totemic and important issue, where making sure what's in that charter reflects young people's view is a critical part of it. And I was with DAC Adelakin, who's leading that work for us. I was with him and his colleague yesterday doing that work, and so they've done something which I think is very powerful, where they said they've started off this consultation process literally with a blank sheet of paper. So whilst we have some professional ideas what should be in it, actually let's start with the blank sheet of paper, and as we go through the consultation, see what comes from communities, so that we don't colour the debate by us putting a professional view on the table at the start. And I think that's really powerful.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you. And that's really interesting to hear about the process for the charter. I'd like to bring in Assembly Member Ahmed, and we're moving to look at culture change.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. Deputy Mayor, thinking back to where we were a year ago and how much has happened in that year, I'd like to ask you what you and when you expect to see real change, real cultural change within the Met.
That's a really difficult question, isn't it? Because I think we all know cultural, long-lasting cultural change is difficult to achieve and takes time. However, we are already seeing the foundations for that cultural change being placed and being delivered within the Met. So, I think, the Commissioner will be able to confirm this, In his first few days as Commissioner, he was very, very clear in terms of what the standards are that police officers are expected to adhere to, that incredibly clear about what was acceptable behaviour and unacceptable behaviour. That's the foundation. That gives a very clear sort of baseline, doesn't it? So we've already seen those steps being taken. We've also seen, and from the update at the end of March, the significant number and the change in way in which misconduct is being tackled within the Met, from the number of suspensions rising, the number of cases being got through, and also the timeliness for those cases to be got through. So we can see that happening. But there's structural change that does need to happen. And I'm sure that you'll be asking the Commissioner more about what he's doing with the professional standards units and the proposals around there, which is significant change, structural change, which really will make a difference in terms of that cultural change. And then, of course, that's all internal facing. We need to see that change happen, how people perceive the service, people, Londoners perceive the service that they are being delivered by those officers, and that cultural change within that will take time, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't expect progress quickly, but it will take time for it to be embedded and for there to be real lasting transformation.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I'm sure you will want to address the issue of professional standards in your response, but could you update us on the progress of the new dedicated cultural change team at the Met?
Okay, that's certainly one part of this of what needs covering. I just think picking up on selecting senior people and that team. We've got a team looking at the work, or some of the work already. But I think the sort of cultural change piece is much wider than that. So, a few points I wanted to draw out. Changes in leadership, I think, is key. Getting the right leadership for the sort of new Met for London, what we want to be. If I reflect on, compared to sort of, a year ago, just before I started, the sort of the top 11 people, the last couple of people are just landing who've been appointed, but those 11 people will be 2 people who are the same, 4 people who've been promoted within the organisation, and 5, including myself and the deputy, who've come in from outside. So that's giving a sense of the degree of change and the sort of, I can give you some of the data in terms of the next tier in the organisation. So a reset in terms of leadership for people who have got the right skills and approaches for the challenges ahead is a big part of what we're doing, and that flows into, we're doing a 1-week leadership development programme for all of our frontline leaders. That's 7,500 sergeants and police staff equivalents. We've got through 2,000 of them already. The feedback on the course is fantastically positive, and that's dealing with a whole range of issues, including standards and cultural issues, issues about how it sort of helping people raise their awareness about how we deal with violence against women and girls and those sorts of factors. And we're looking at development for other tiers of leadership at the moment as well. So I think leadership is a big theme that comes out of cultural change. How do you bring to life something and wire it through the organisation? We've set a series of principles alongside our values, which are really challenging and are starting to drive decision making. 5 principles, and I talk about this in the New Met for London events. 5 principles: putting communities first, being frontline focused. It comes out of Casey that we don't support our frontline as well as we should do in a myriad of ways. Thirdly, being inclusive, becoming an anti-discriminatory organisation. 4th, being collaborative. I think a big organisation like the Met isn't always as collaborative as we ought to be, whether it's with communities or other organisations. And 5th, being precise, using our limited resources as effectively and precisely as possible, using data and intelligence. Those principles, particularly thinking about the first 2 or 3 around inclusivity and communities first, etc., wiring those into the promotion process, the selection process, everything we do in terms of how we make decisions, I think is critical. So finding a practical way to wire a different way that we all behave through the organisation, and then have it sort of building the core team that deal with that. So there's a lot we're doing in terms of the sort of, if you like, strengthening the culture, because I think we have to see this as 2 parts. The body that is the Met, there's a minority that, because of systemic failings, has more effect than it ought to. That cancer needs cutting out, and we'll come to that in a minute. But a lot of this needs to be about the health of the majority, so it becomes a stronger, fitter organisation that repels infection, repels bad, unacceptable and criminal behaviour. And that's why we're spending so much time and thinking about that and trying to build the expertise from people within and outside the organisation. In terms of the misconduct side of it, so we've strengthened a lot more resource in that area, 150 extra people into the Anti-Corruption and Abuse Command, and as Deputy Mayor says, sort of more people being suspended, sacked, etc. And the full detailed picture and latest stats are just being finalised in a paper which will be going to the first London Policing Board in the next few weeks. So that balance between sorting out the sort of the acute issues and building a healthy organisation is what we're working through. I haven't turned in my answers to sort of discrimination and diversity issues because I saw them on the agenda as a separate matter, so I'm assuming there's further questions on them.
I have got a couple of questions, but I mean, where are we with the dedicated culture team, which is what the cultural change team, which was my question? You've given a really good overview of what needs to happen, what's happening, but what is that team doing and what progress is there from that team? So
we've got so culture sits within our culture and professionalism area, led by Assistant Commissioner Barbara Gray. She's been supported by DAC Andy Valentine, and there's a team around them. We've been looking for a senior member of police staff with expertise from outside. We've gone through a recruitment process. We haven't yet found the right person, and we're looking at other ways that we might strengthen that team. So that team is at the centre of this work in terms of defining these principles and working out how to drive that through the organisation. But it isn't all on the it's not just on the call to change. It's about the neighbourhood policing programme and changing our approach to engaging with communities. It's about the work we're doing to strengthen our approach in terms of supporting victims of crime, and some good improvements in that area, and we're about to launch an enhanced victim care hub to support victims more the way through the process. We're going to give victims the opportunity to give immediate feedback on the officers and staff who support them, so we can learn more dynamically and affect the culture by getting that immediate feedback. So there's multiple strands to changing culture, and the culture team's at the hub of it, but they're not the whole picture.
Sure. Thank you. And just in terms of strands, could you tell us about the progress on establishing the race working group and what it is that you want that group to do and the aims of that group?
So the race working group is a part of us working towards our own race action plan. Historically, the Met had... So there's a national race action plan being built in policing, and historically the Met approach has been that sort of we will pay attention to that, but have a separate stride, the stride plan around sort of diversity and inclusion. We've sort of moved away from that approach. Actually, there's a national approach. There's lots of expertise and thinking going into that. Why would we be different? Why don't we follow that? And that's the work we're doing. In terms of converting the National Race Action Plan into something for London that sort of builds a detail for us, there's a dedicated team working on that, led by Chief Superintendent Jeff Booth, and that plan, and also our plans to deal with. There are four groups that have four sizable groups that have sort of lower confidence. That 3 came out of the Casey report, and 1 extra that we're going to do sort of parallel plans for. That's sort of based around race, misogyny, homophobia, and ableism, and those 4 plans are being worked up. And certainly the race one will be ready. The plan is by December.
Okay, thank you. And finally, LGBT plus Londoners continue to be the group that have the lowest levels of trust and confidence in the Met. How does your new Met for London plan intend to rebuild that trust and confidence, specifically with that group?
So, as I've just said, one of the 4 plans in terms of an action plan is in terms of homophobia. And secondly, the first step we took was we've appointed 12 new liaison officers across London. That was something that existed sort of 5 or 10 years ago, but I think got squeezed out through various budget cuts and other initiatives. And so re-establishing on each BCU an LGBT plus liaison officer, I think is very positive and very welcome, so that if there are issues that aren't being reported to us or concerns that aren't being raised through normal channels, if we can have those relationships to have that better understanding, so that we're more agile in responding, perhaps to hate crime that we're not seeing a picture of. This isn't about simply about relationships and engagement. It's about understanding the crime, disorder and trust issues that communities are facing, so we've got a better side to them so we can tackle them better. And you'll also have seen that sort of been engaging with sort of leaders in those communities, and sort of made a sort of reflection and apology for sort of some of the history of policing and LGBT plus communities, and how we've got some things wrong in the past and how we're looking to be different in the future.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Cooper, you can come in very briefly, and please make the answer very brief as well, because thank you.
Thank you. I mean, obviously there are some boroughs where there is a larger LGBTQ plus community, and there are more venues. For example, Lambeth, the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, and the 2 Brewers being probably 2 of the most notable venues, particularly recently the Brewers with the vicious attack outside. Do you really think 12 is enough? And do you also think that, bearing in mind the rock bottom nature of the relationship at the moment, given Port, and I think Casey's laid it open, do you think there should be more assistance going into, perhaps this is one for the Deputy Mayor, to things like Gallop and Switchboard, where people might feel more comfortable at the moment in reporting things that have happened to them rather than going direct to the police?
So 12 liaison officers are not 12 officers dealing with all crime and all issues reported by LGBT plus communities in London. They're a focal point to strengthen the relationship. Where you've got a particularly vibrant local gay community, or perhaps sort of nighttime economy, sort of related issues, then you've got the local neighbourhood and community policing team who should be having the right relationships there as well. So the liaison officers is complementing it. It's not trying to take on all of that load. So I don't see that as inconsistent. But of course, it's a step forward. If we decide the balance is wrong, then of course we can review it in due course. But I think it's a positive step forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I bring in Assembly Member Bailey?
Good morning, Deputy Mayor and Commissioner. Nice to see you both. You've partly answered this question. It's about your willingness to adopt a national racial action plan, and you've said you have. But just how advanced is the work with any particular communities? You identified 4 communities that you want to do the work with. Is that work near completion, near the beginning? Where are we at? So
the intention is that certainly I think the race action plan and possibly others I'd have to double check are the race action plan's due for completion by Christmas. So that conversation, those work are ongoing.
Okay, so let me move on. This is a question for the Commissioner. What work has been done on the commitment in the new Met for London to commission research into the overall crime disparity, and what does this research involve, and when do you expect it to be completed? I appointed a chief scientific advisor, and him and some of our analysts are doing that work at the moment. It's certainly going to be this year, but I haven't got an exact date in my mind for it. And also, Mopac are looking, I think, at doing some similar work in the area. I think if you look at the race action plan, for example, it talks about communities feeling both over policed and under protected. It's important we deal with both issues. And you'll have heard me mention here in the past, for example, that young black men are 13 times more likely to be murdered than young white men in London. That's a ghastly disproportionality. And sort of just as we need to be thoughtful about how we do stop and search, for example, and are we getting it right, and is it having the right effect on crime, but also we're doing it in a way which builds trust rather than damages it, alongside getting stop and search right. We need to think about, actually, if crime is falling so unevenly on communities in different ways, how are we working with those problems? And having the right data is critical. And in the new Met for London plan, reporting on disproportionalities across trust about how crime falls and about how police act, I think all of those disproportionalities are important, so we get a full understanding of the picture so that we can do the best job for every community, recognising that, say, crime and trust falls very differently. So are we at the point where the Met will be taking new and different measures? For instance, let's focus on young black men because of the horrific statistic you just gave. So for instance, we talked about the LGBT community, plus community, and 12 liaison officers. Is there something in your thinking that this research might give up to give additional support or a different tactic to the way in which you interact with young black men or the black community, wider black community?
Absolutely. So I'm sort of meeting with different groups of of leaders of black communities to discuss some of these issues. They say that the changing approach to stop and search, which is both about how it's done in terms of skills of officers, but it's also about how it's deployed. Can we deploy it more precisely based on hotspots, working with communities to have a greater effect when we have surges, for example, in knife crime? So we are looking for how we operate differently and how we do it in a way which builds trust of communities rather than feeling imposed. So that's part of it. But I think we need a more rounded public debate on these issues, because the conversations that take place with me and with local police leaders on disproportionality pretty much entirely focus on disproportionate use of police tactics and almost never focus on disproportionate victimisation in crime, where different groups are more likely to be victims. And we need to be talking about those two things alongside each other. Otherwise, we're not discussing the problem in the round. And actually, it's young black men who are let down because we're not prepared to talk about it. Because, when we had potentially 2 times disproportionality during COVID, there was a massive uproar about that, and and medical professionals and experts looked at that, and there was a whole load of debate around it. Here we've got a much more acute unfairness that
we don't have the rounded conversation about it because we're all nervous about talking about race issues, and we need to have a constructive way of talking about that helps all communities be equally safe in London in a way that I don't see us doing that at the moment. And I can start some of that conversation, but it needs to come from communities, it needs to come from politicians and others.
I couldn't agree more, and I welcome your emphasis on that disproportionality of the victims as well, not just the police. What the police are doing. Can I pose a similar question to the Deputy Mayor in that, is there anything that MOPAC could be doing to help broaden the conversation? Because we had lots of conversation about, police tactics and disproportionality there, but the disproportionality of, the victims of crime, in this case young black men, is there something that MOPAC could be doing to help strengthen that narrative, bring it more to the fore?
I think it's an incredibly important conversation, but I think you have to widen it from race because actually we have already been doing quite a lot of research and publishing a lot of statistics and analysis of what is happening in London. And when you look at victimisation, absolutely you can see young black men in victimisation, but you can also see that it's socioeconomic factors and poverty and deprivation, lack of educational attainment and lack of opportunity that is really driving victimisation. So we have to widen it out. So it's not just an issue for MOPAC, it's an issue for City Hall, and that's one of the things the Violence Reduction Unit is very clear about in terms of making sure that it's focusing in those geographical areas and those communities where victimisation and violence is strongest. And of course across City Hall we have a number of programmes and projects and delivered into those areas, and particularly looking at how do we support and ensure that we've got support for example for young black men into particular sectors of industry, into particular sectors, to ensure that they've got more opportunities for training and employment as well. It's about really thinking about widening that out and looking at the socioeconomic factors that is driving crime, victimisation and violence.
I see your point, and again I agree, but because the problem is so acute, and in our approach to other things has been to focus on effectively a protective factor, I think in this one instance, because it is the most serious instance, and obviously I have a slightly vested interest, so I think the race issue is important. And if we don't discuss that, and I take the Commissioner's point that we need politicians to discuss it, because there's something particular to young black men, the huge levels of violence that they suffer, the ripple that then creates not just for the black community but Londoners in general. I think there's something very particular there, and we've been very particular about other things, LGBT plus community, violence against women and girls, which is correct. I think this might need a particular focus as well.
Nobody's denying that we need to be thinking about and talking to black communities, and that's what we are doing. I have regular meetings myself with black-led organisations to ensure that, in terms of engagement with the Metropolitan Police, that their issues and their concerns are dealt with. Nobody's, of course we need to be thinking about that and talking about that, and nobody is shying away from that. What I'm saying is that it's not the colour of somebody's skin that determines whether they're a victim or whether they're an offender. It's driven much more, it's driven by socioeconomic factors, and that's why I've talked about that in my answer to you previously.
I agree, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, excuse me, I just promoted you there. I agree, Deputy Mayor, except for one thing where the stats would suggest you're wrong. It is the colour of your skin, and in this case, the fact of your boy, that determines your likelihood to be murdered 13 times more.
I think if you look at the Violence Reduction Unit's research about protective factors around homicide, absolutely, you can see in the statistics that young black men are, 13 times more likely to be a victim. But when you look at protective factors, it is much wider. It is wider, and that is a more nuanced conversation that we need to have, and we are having. And I know we've had this conversation before.
Okay, thank you. I don't say it to you as a challenge, I just say it to you as a plea. Let me quickly shoot on, because I can see the chair is fidgeting. What changes have been made to the way the Met reviews body-worn camera footage, and what impact has this had on the identification of discriminatory practices? This suggests that practices are discriminatory. I'll give you the opportunity to suggest maybe not.
I think the vast majority of time, the vast majority of officers aren't discriminatory,
Yes.
but there are cases which are clearly wrong, and we deal with them, and the IRPC deal with them. In terms of the review of body-worn video, we have supervisors reviewing large numbers of them and sort of scoring those based on their judgment, and they score the majority of them to be good.
but clearly that's not enough in and of itself. You'd expect supervisors to be looking over people's shoulder. That's their job. But it's critical. It's critical that communities have a role in that. And we've had different community scrutiny groups for some time, and those have been sort of now. There's the, I think, PEPs, police, something panels, I can't remember the full acronym, where they're looking and sort of scoring videos. I think it's important that they are selecting them, sort of, so it's not sort of ones we select. And there's different practices across London, and we're looking at the best practice in that. And again, in the stop and search charter work we're doing, in there will be commitments about how communities are involved in reviewing the practice of officers, and I think that's really, really important to give that feedback as quickly as possible.
Would you say the community groups involved, if they were sat in front of us now, would they be happy with their input, with their influence, with what they're learning from this process?
I think you get a mixed reaction, frankly. I think there's mixed practice across London. I think some of them, the groups work well, they have full access, they see a lot of good stop and search, and they see some things that are wrong, and they see action taken. I think in some cases they wouldn't say that. I think there's issues about how the process works and the sort of, and I've had some of these conversations in the new Met for London sort of roadshow events. I think in some cases the conversations are too sort of binary. Either this is right or wrong. Where but there's a lot in between. Where there's nothing sort of illegal or misconduct in the way this has been done, but the officer could do it better, and they need to get some feedback. And I think sort of that, in using it sort of with communities to have a sort of a learning approach for a big part of this, as well as spotting the most extreme examples of outstanding work and sort of and awful work, I think is really important. And I think that's one of the things I'm sure will come out of the consultation and the stop and search charter.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. And now Assemblymember Pigeon.
Yeah, I wanted to pursue a bit more around stop and search, and you touched on it. So can you just clarify? I mean, you talked about different groups scoring videos, different practices across London, and then so in your plan you talk about increased transparency through community networks, monitoring groups and so on, but you've also got existing structures. Can you just talk me through where you are with all of that and the timelines for firming up how you're going to have oversight, and if you've got any feedback on the impact any of these have had so far? And then in terms of the charter, which you talked a lot to me about earlier, who's going to monitor compliance with the charter?
So I think that who monitors compliance with the charter? I think the consultation on the charter will sort of be part will be part of answering that, because I'm sure it will draw out how we give feedback to communities and how communities are able to oversee it. We will certainly have within the Met, whatever's in the charter, we will have sort of performance data and sort of monitoring data, so that I and my senior team can keep track of, are we complying with what we said to the public. I haven't had this conversation with the Deputy Mayor or the Mayor, but I think I can bet that they will be asking for reports on compliance on it, which is great, and it will come into the public domain that way, and that's how it ought to be. I think that we will come up with a standard, frankly, which we won't be able to hit overnight, and I think it might take a year to implement it. But we need to be honest. If we're saying, okay, this is the legal requirement, this is what the communities of London through our consultation are saying in the charter, I think in some areas we'll be doing well, some areas will be more patchy. It may require a lot more training of officers in terms of skill sets, but we can be candid about the journey to get there and deliver it. There's no point coming up with a charter that isn't stretching and isn't different. So we'll be charting a path through that and being very, very public about it. I say we have stop and search monitoring groups, scrutiny groups with communities all the way across London. They are variable. Frankly, I haven't myself dived into that recently, because I'm seeing this charter work is going to raise the bar and say that's the standard for the future.
Okay, and so these things in your plan, introducing community networks and monitoring groups, this is a change, a refresh to what's gone on before. Before,
exactly that. And sort of, but then how they operate will be influenced by the charter as well.
So it's all going to
exactly. Yeah.
So the timescale you're saying?
The charter's certainly before Christmas. I think it's
is coming back to me from the conversation yesterday. We're aiming for November.
Okay. And then it will be implemented.
There's an awful lot of consultation to that. And then the timeline for implementation will depend on what's in there, and some bases we've got covered, as I say, and some will have more work to do.
Yeah, and you're right. It's not just officers behaving in the letter of the law, it's the spirit.
Yeah.
And that, as you say, might technically be correct, but actually how does the person feel?
To give one example, there's a sort of idea from lots of research across multiple sectors, not just policing, about the idea about procedural justice. When somebody with authority is making a decision that affects you, there are ways that interaction can be handled which leave you feeling that was just unfair, whether or not you get the answer you wanted out of it, and there are clearly ways that don't. And so using that approach, we're doing some testing at the moment, training some officers and doing some testing, and I can imagine something like that will be part of the future, and we'll need to do a lot of training to bring it to life.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I bring in Assembly Member Hall?
Yeah, I think we can be quite quick on this, Commissioner. It was reported in July that Met police officers must declare all romantic relationships. What is the minimum threshold that the Met is using to define a romantic relationship?
I'll have to write back to you on the detail of our policy. But I think we're not trying to run some sort of, Victorian moral sort of inquisition.
Well, good.
But clearly, and people fall in love in the workplace in all walks of life, and none of us want to get in the way of that. But if a supervisor is having a relationship with one of their team and it's undeclared, that is not ethical. So there are some issues that any organisation should be concerned about, without becoming prurient and some sort of moral arbiter, and that's what our sort of approach does. So we can come back to you on the detail on that.
Yeah, that would be interesting. That's for sure. Do you think that, given Met data breach that's just occurred, do you think, given that officers will be confident that sort of information will be kept secure?
It's made people very nervous. Of course, it has. Officers or staff in any organisation expect the organisation they're working for to look after their personal data. That's in a world of sort of cybercrime and hostile state activity, particularly when you're a public body like us. That's a higher and higher bar to get over. But we need to be able to say to our officers, we set the highest standards possible in terms of protecting that information. And that's why we're doing such a robust piece of work on this individual case, and also why I immediately commissioned the weekend this broke, this review to look across all of our commercial relationships where we're sharing personal data, to make sure our sort of commercial and data approaches are as robust as is practical.
Yeah. I mean, the thing I'm concerned about is obviously an additional layer of personal information. If you've got on file what relationships they're having. And do you think that police officers or people that want to become police officers might think that this is really intrusive and could be putting more people off joining the Met?
I don't think it's a problem as long as the issue is proportionate. It's not about every romantic relationship, but it is about romantic relationships which compromise integrity in the workplace, and it's being appropriate and precise about that.
Okay, be interested to see the guidelines. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think that's normal practice across most organisations. If I was working for Barclays Bank, I'm sure they would have I don't know why I picked Barclays, but I'm sure they'd have a policy in terms of reporting workplace relationships between supervisors and the people who work for them.
So it's purely workplace?
It is for most vetting. I mean, clearly, national security vetting has higher requirements, but okay. I don't think that was what you meant by your question.
Yeah. Thank you. Just very briefly, going back to the stop and search, you mentioned earlier about the number of arrests at Notting Hill not being disproportionate to other events like big football matches and things like that. I was wondering, do you have data on the outcomes of the stops and searches at Notting Hill, and are you able to if you can't do it here, perhaps in writing after, but the numbers we witnessed when we were at Notting Hill, we witnessed a lot of people being stopped and searched, taken out of the crowd by the TSG, and I just wondered what the outcome rate of those searches was in terms of how many of those searches actually found anything, and how those outcome rates from those searches compares to the outcome rates at other types of events.
I think they were comparable from the data I've seen. I can't pluck it out the back of my mind. We can write to you on the detail, but I did mention, I think it was 71 knives, 1 or 2 firearms in and around the footprint that were recovered from search activity. So quite significant recovery. But I think the success rate, if you like, was comparable. But let me, and obviously some other recovery is drugs and other issues as well. But let me come back to you on that.
Thank you very much. Assembly member, no. Sorry, it is me. So, Deputy Mayor, a new Met for London, do you think that it goes far enough to ensure that discrimination has no place in the Met?
I think it's laid up. Yes, I do intend, but as we've already discussed, it will be the proof of the pudding will be in the delivery of it and the impact of it, and that is going to be incredibly important. One of the things we've been asked earlier about is, what is MOPAC's role in this, and what was MOPAC's role in the new Met for London plan? We have aligned, we've worked very hard with the Met around the performance indicators, which are in the new Met for London plan, and we can, there are very clear performance indicators around cultural change and discrimination. Around, are you feeling, are you able to, are you confident in your leaders? Do you feel safe to challenge inappropriate behaviour? The number of staff and officers who say they're treated fairly. So those are the measures that we will be tracking, as well as the outcome of misconduct cases. And we also want to see a change in the disproportionality in the number of referrals into misconduct procedures, because that really, whilst there is some very small disproportionality in the outcomes, actually it's the referral into the formal misconduct procedures. We also want to see a change in that, and that was very clear from the Casey review as well as MOPAC research from 2016 and 2019, actually, in terms of the misconduct procedures and the disproportionality in referrals. So I absolutely have confidence that the right things have been put in place. We've got to make sure that those begin to take effect very quickly, and then we can see long-term change.
Yep. And Commissioner, the new Met for London states that the Met will examine its policies and practices and change any that are discriminatory by July 2023. So has that examination been completed, and what was the outcome, and what changes have been made as a result?
I'd have to write back to you on the detail of that. I say we're working through systematically issues of discrimination, whether it's about reviewing policies, whether it's about our caseload of misconduct in terms of looking backwards at past decisions on cases of sexual harassment and racial allegations, dealing differently with cases going forward. I've mentioned building the different action plans earlier on. The Deputy Mayor has mentioned the performance framework and how that captures issues around discrimination, such as how it feels to be in the workplace, and the issues around values and culture that I've spoken about, and inclusivity. This is a massive challenge in a big organisation, and where you've got a history of systemic failings and confronting those stage by stage. I'm not going to pretend we're going to get perfectly right overnight, but I am seeing a difference, and not in all parts of the Met, but I am seeing officers in some parts of the Met who are saying to me, boss, it's starting to feel different, and that's encouraging, and that's not even across the whole organisation, but I am seeing the signs that the measures we're taking and the change in tone and change in approach is having an effect.
That anecdotal feedback is useful to hear, but it would be great to have that written response, just in terms of what had happened by July 2023. Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. Will the Met, this is to the Commissioner, will the Met have completed the reform of professionalism by October 2023, which is in a few weeks' time, as was set out in the new Met for London?
Yeah, so that's about reforming the structure and how it operates. That's not suggesting that we'll have sorted every issue out in the organisation. So the answer to that first part is yes, based on the plans we have so far, but it will be constantly evolving because there's a massive amount of work to do. Not least, for example, you'll have seen that I'm grateful the government's responded to calls to change the regulations, and that was announced last week, and I'm sort of told that potentially the first stages of those changes can be in place as early as January potentially, which would be really helpful if they are, because being able to work through the caseload as effectively and quickly as we need to, and having the opportunity to make the right decisions is going to be absolutely critical. So that in itself will generate some changes in process, which will require more changes to professionalism command, but that's all very welcome.
Which kind of moves me on to my next question, which is about when will the Met's review of misconduct cases involving discrimination be completed? I mean, it's obviously a difficult area.
Difficult area. So we're still working our way through all the work we were doing on the cases involving sexual harassment. We have a plan to review the cases of some historic cases around allegations of racism. And we'll be giving an update on the timings and details of that for the London Policing Board.
But obviously you appreciate how important it is to do this, because as somebody put it to me, it's a bit hard to expect someone who's a victim of rape to report it to somebody who could potentially be a rapist, and it's very difficult to expect someone who's black to report racism to someone who might be a racist. So I think, you know, the cases based on discrimination are really important to go through.
And it is definitely true that confidence is dented, and I get the same bits of feedback that you've just mentioned, and it is a sort of salutary reminder. I'm encouraged, though, that whilst confidence and trust are dented, they are not broken. So, for example, we haven't seen a dramatic downturn in allegations of rape. So we're not seeing it when it comes to that moment, people not calling us, from what we can see. But clearly it has put a question in people's minds, and we need to remove that question by being vigorous at sorting these matters out. I completely agree with you.
Okay. The Met has said it will establish a challenge panel. I'm going to come to the Deputy Mayor for this, to oversee further reform and hold the Met to account for reducing discrimination in its misconduct processes. How will this panel work alongside the London Policing Board?
So this is a Metropolitan Police challenge panel, so I think it's probably more appropriate
for the
for me to answer it. Yeah.
The Commissioner is looking keen to answer it. Very keen to answer it.
Very keen to answer it. So I was going to make a flippant comment then, but I won't. Sort of very keen to answer it. It's quite a. It's evolving, but basically the professionalism team have pulled together a group of people from outside the Met, people with experience working in third sector and other areas around violence against women and girls and around race issues, and looking through cases. And it's particularly focused because of all the review work on harassment and sort of sexual allegations history. It's particularly focused on that to start off with, and looking at as we're making decisions which are not straightforward, looking at all of those and sort of sifting through them, and that's been really very, very helpful, and that will keep developing that work.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And can I remind our last questioners we need to keep this as speedy as we can because we're up against a deadline. But Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, still is good morning. Good morning, Deputy Mayor. If I can ask you about a couple of questions about racism in the Met. So do you believe that the Met is on the right path to tackle racism within the service? And how is MOPAC supporting the Met to tackle this issue? What more needs to be done?
I think in terms of what's been set out in the new Met for London plan, I really welcome the fact that, and the Commissioner's just talked about it, that they are going to set up a similar operation to the ones that have been looking at sexual harassment, to look at race discrimination complaints. And I think we really, really welcome that. And we're working with the Met in terms of, again, some external challenge around that, as they have done with Project Onyx. Obviously, in terms of the role of MOPAC and oversight, we will continue to make sure that we have a view and oversight of the cases that come in. We are asking, going back to Assembly Members Pitchen's question around body-worn video, the conversation we had last week at Oversight Board around stop and search and body-worn video was very much, well, what has the impact of that scrutiny? And there is good scrutiny of body-worn video, not only externally by community groups. It can be mixed, but by community groups, but internally as well. There's a real grip of that. What has the impact been? So that oversight is there, and we'll continue to do that.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I will write to you in due course because we are limited for time. But Commissioner, I do have a question for you. Before I ask you my question, can I say that I attended the consultation meeting in Dagenham, at Dagenham and Graduate Football Club with Assistant Commissioner Louise Rose. And it was good, very well attended, very positive. And can also echo what the Chair said about Nottingham Carnival. That was a Met at its best.
Thank you.
The Operations Centre in particular, which I attend every single year since I've been at City Hall, and then the policing itself. And a special mention of the Marine Police. I didn't know they'd actually worked on the day, but to take the trip with them along the Grand Union Canal was a bit of an eye-opener. And they're based in Wapping, in my constituency as well. Commissioner, this is a question I really should have asked you earlier, but and thank you, the Chair, for allowing me to raise this issue now. There was a recent article in The Guardian, a very recent article, in fact, which reported freedom of information data showing that across England and Wales, lost or unavailable evidence was responsible for 7,316 cases of pre-trial collapses between September 21 and September 22, including 16 homicides and 123 sexual offences. How much of an issue is this in London, in the Met? And how have you improved evidence handling in the wake of Casey?
In terms of the specific data on that freedom of information request, I don't know the Met's numbers, and I can come back to you on that. As I spoke about earlier in our report, the new Met for London plan, the foundations of the organisation are an issue that we've got much to do, where the equipment and facilities aren't what they need to be. And one example of that is the sort of fridges issue that comes out of the Casey report, where the basic equipment of having sort of reliable, high standard fridges that are sort of working to hold sort of particular forensic evidence wasn't as good as it needs to be. They've all been reviewed, and they're being and the ones that need replacing are in the process of being replacing, as an example. So there's a second example comes out of Daniel Morgan report, which is about exhibits handling, and there's a whole series of pieces of work being done to strengthen the way exhibits are handled, and the facilities available to officers to store them. The big piece of work will take take years to do and links into estates, but the core of creating a better system is in place. And our new technology, the Connect system, which is still bedding in, but one part of it that's really good is the exhibits handling system part, and that's helping us keep better track records of it. So getting those basics underpinnings right is a key part of our plan, and we're on that. And I know the Chair's trying to work to this, but I've got to get away about midday, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bailey.
The Baroness Casey report says that nothing the Met is doing The Baroness Casey report said that nothing the Met is doing or plans to do will change the proportion, will address the deficit of black officers in the Met that you're recruiting. Do you agree?
No. That is a very binary statement. The Met has been making progress and is going forward. It is not as fast as any of us would want, but just to I've got the numbers, the exact numbers here, but I think our recruiting our recruiting is leading to a growth in the number of black, Asian, other minority ethnic heritage officers in the organisation and female officers. Our recruiting data tends to show it bounces between about 25 and 35% of our intakes of recruits are, say, black, Asian, and other minority ethnic heritage. Clearly, that's not what London is, but it's
still quite a high proportion.
It's still pretty high. It's still pretty good, and that's lifting our percentage of those officers in the organisation. I think it's now tipping sort of 17 or 18% from my recollection, or I can confirm the figures afterwards. 17, yeah. And then likewise, in terms of gender, the number of women officers applying, I think, is around, if you've got numbers in front of you, around 40%, and I think our number of women officers in the organisation is now tipped 30. So we're drawing the numbers upwards
quite it would
impressively.
Be fair to say you're outperforming Baroness Casey's estimation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that quote suggests that nothing is changing. It is changing. I mean, without dramatic changes in legislation like that in Northern Ireland to move it at the pace that many would say was a good idea, it isn't possible, but we're doing everything we possibly can do. We have in the past had London-only recruitment criteria, which has helped, but at the moment with the recruiting challenges, I can't do that. But we're pulling every we can do. I mean, all of our advertising is targeted to try and increase these numbers. We do work on attrition. So I was doing a passing out parade last Friday at Hendon, and I met 4 officers who are part of the support team that do extra work to support say minority officers when they're landing in the organisation. So there's a load of work to do this, which is generating some excellent results. But of course, I know everyone would like it to go faster, myself as well as Louise, but it's not right to say we're not making progress.
It sounds like you're doing significantly better. Just one last small point to Assemblymember Duval's comments earlier on about attrition. Is attrition amongst black officers, ethnic officers, any higher?
So there is a difference, and black officers is higher. So that's one of the things we've been looking at in terms of our processes. Is different attrition levels, different use of Regulation 13, which is when officers are there's a sort of more expeditious way of removing officers in their first 2 years if they're not likely to become a fit and effective officer, whereas after 2 years it's much harder. So the use of that power is disproportionate as well. So we're looking at those issues as part of our review of discrimination.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And in the interest of finishing on time, I've just got one quick question for the Deputy Mayor, which is that the latest quarterly update report on the Mayor's Transparency, Accountability and Trust in Policing Action Plan on MOPAC's website is dated from June 2022, and the last quarterly public review meeting is December 2022. With the focus to be confirmed. So is MOPAC no longer providing these updates on the action plan or engaging with communities to review that progress made? And if so, sort of why? What's going on here?
I will look into why we haven't got those updates on the website, because they should be there, and we are still continuing to have our quarterly update meetings. The last one was in either June or July in Ilford, in Redbridge, on a boiling hot evening, and it was very well attended. So we are still doing them. I will look into why we're not making sure that that's clear on our website.
Thank you
Thanks.
very much.
Can I make one quick final point, if you wouldn't mind? Just, we talked a lot about trust, and you can see my ambition and sort of the majority of my colleagues' ambition to improve trust and confidence in the Mayor, and it's not where we want it to be. I think it's always helpful to sort of benchmark these things so that the public presentation has a balance to it. I think it's worth pointing out that both sort of trust issues and confidence in trust issues in the Mayor and confidence, we are around or above the national average in policing, and compared to the other big cities, we are above them in we're top of the pile in sort of most respects. So we are desperate to do a better job for London. There's lots we need to be better at, as we've discussed today. But I wouldn't want people watching this debate to be thinking that the Met's dropped off the bottom of the pile, but that's not the case.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
It is your right to remind us of all the very good work that is going on. But I think also your candour in answering our questions today. It's a powerful symbol of the commitment to reforms that we've been talking about all morning, and I hope that that goes forward into the conversations that we expect to have with the Deputy Mayor's team and your team, and as we work out how our scrutiny arrangements work out in light of the Policing Board. Now, I'd like to thank our guests for attending this morning and for their answers to our questions. And I'd like the committee, please, to note the report and the discussion. And to note the monthly report from the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. And delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting. We will now adjourn the meeting for 5 minutes before completing the remaining business on our agenda. I would like to welcome Rory McKenna, the GLA's monitoring officer, to the meeting. Would you like to introduce your report to the committee?
Thank you, Chair. Assembly members, the previous monitoring officer recorded 2 complaints under the elected policing bodies Complaints and Misconduct Regulations 2012 in connection with the departure of Dame Cressida Dick from her role as Commissioner of the Met Police, and those were recorded against the Mayor in his capacity as the occupant of Mopac. The content of the 2 recorded complaints is set out in my report at section 3.1. The previous monitoring officer was required under the regulations to determine whether the recorded complaints were serious complaints. Complaints that are found to be serious complaints must be referred to the Independent Office for Police Conduct to consider whether to investigate them. To help inform the previous monitoring officer's assessment and determination as to whether the complaints were serious complaints, she sought the opinion of a King's Counsel criminal barrister as to whether the complaints were serious complaints. That is, whether they are complaints made about the conduct which constitutes or involves or appears to constitute or involve the commission of a criminal offence. In my report at section 4.14, Council's opinion sets out the law related to misconduct in public office and the application of complaints to the offence of misconduct in public office. With regard to both of these complaints, in Council's opinion, the conduct complained of did not pass the threshold for misconduct in public office and was not criminal in nature. The previous monitoring officer reached a conclusion that the recorded complaints were not serious complaints under the regulations and therefore were not referred to the IOPC. This meant that the recorded complaints were dealt with under the GLA ethical standards regime for assessing complaints alleging a breach of the GLA Code of Conduct for elected members. Paragraph 49 of the GLA guidance says, a complaint which has been recorded about the office holder of MOPAC and which is not required to be referred to the IOPC shall be dealt with by the monitoring officer as if it were a written complaint made under the GLA ethical standards regime. Paragraph 50 of the guidance goes on to say, the monitoring officer shall, as soon as practicable, inform the committee of the outcome of the complaint. As the GLA's current monitoring officer, and after consulting with the GLA's independent person, I have now considered the complaints under the GLA ethical standards regime and determined that no further action needs to be taken with either complaint, and I have written to both the complainants with the outcome. No response has been received. In undertaking my initial assessment, paragraph 3.3 of the complaints guidance requires me to take into account the wider public interest and the cost to the public purse of undertaking any investigation into alleged breaches of the code. In this regard, I was mindful that A. Sir Tom Windsor, by special commission from the Home Secretary on the 25th of March 2022, was appointed to establish and assess the full facts, timeline of events and circumstances which resulted in the former Commissioner stepping aside and whether due process was followed. That commission has resulted in the publication of a detailed and lengthy report. I'm also mindful that the previous monitoring officer reviewed the conduct described within the Windsor report and whether there were grounds for referring the complaints to the IOPC. The fact that the issues raised by the complaints have already been subject to a detailed consideration by two separate processes, the outcome of which have already been made public, means that there is very limited public interest in a further investigation under the GLA ethical standards regime. While I appreciate that those processes are separate to the GLA ethical standards regime, it appears unlikely that a further investigation under that regime would reveal anything new that has not already been brought to light by the two earlier processes. Therefore, bearing in mind the cost to the public purse of commissioning a further investigation, I concluded that taking action on these complaints would not be proportionate. Chair, my recommendations are outlined as sections 2.1 and 2.2 of my report. However, I would also like to add an additional recommendation asking committee to note that the committee has delegated its functions of handling complaints about the Mayor's conduct under the regulations to the monitoring officer. The recommendation now reads as follows: that the committee notes that the Police and Crime Committee, as London's statutory police and crime panel, established under the Policing Reform and Social Responsibility Act 2011, has delegated to the GLA monitoring officer its functions of handling complaints about the Mayor's conduct under the regulations. 2.2, that the committee notes that the current monitoring officer has, after consulting with the GLA's independent person, determined that the complaints under the GLA ethical standards regime and decided that no further action needs to be taken with these complaints. And 2.3, that the committee notes that a copy of the current monitoring officer's initial assessment and the reasons for his decision are appended to my report. Chair, that's my report, and I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do any members have any questions they wish to ask Assembly Member Hall?
I just thought of one. When the committee gave you the power to decide on whether the Mayor needs to answer further, it just relates to those, doesn't it? It doesn't relate to anything in the future. It just relates to these particular complaints.
Do you mean now, sorry, the authority to the monitoring officer for all?
I'm saying, sorry, this is obviously my fault. We gave you the authority, or the monitoring officer, the authority to look at these particular complaints and decide on it. If there are future complaints, does our authority to you still stand, or would we have to give authority to you back again?
No, so it's a standing general authority, but there's 2 stages to the process. So the first stage is, obviously the Mayor of London wears many hats. One of them is the occupant of MOPAC. So if a complaint were to come in his capacity as the occupant of MOPAC, then the first thing that would need to happen is that it gets recorded and the committee would be informed of that complaint. The second part of the process is then the monitoring officer has to make a determination as to whether or not the matter complained of is a serious complaint, and that's what I outlined in my report. Now, at that stage, within the guidance document, so there's a GLA guidance document which is appended to the Code of Conduct, and that sets out how I am to determine and process these complaints when they come in, and there's a consultation process at that stage, which is why the previous monitoring officer back in March brought the item to the committee and asking for their comments as to whether or not she determines the matter to be a serious complaint or not. So if a complaint was to come in tomorrow against the Mayor in his occupant as MOPAC, I would then record the complaint and I would let the committee know that that complaint has come in. Now, the next part of the process is to determine whether or not it is indeed a serious complaint, and in doing that part of it, I am required, and it's Appendix 4 of the GLA Code of Conduct, and I can circulate this after the meeting, that requires consultation with the Police and Crime Committee. Now, that can take one of 2 formats. It can be done via the chair, or it can be done by the committee as a whole. Now, the previous monitoring officer consulted the committee as a whole for that particular stage of the process the last time.
Okay, so yes, it would have to go through that process again. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So I'm slightly unclear. Who makes this decision? Is this our power or the monitoring officer's power? Is the question I need answered. Because we've given that power over, but it sounds like we had no power to give. Let me ask you a question. We have given you, or did we give you the authority to answer this question?
So the answer to that is yes. So it's not. So it's
right.
It's delegated to the post.
Right. Okay. Have we given you that power permanently, or is it on a case-by-case basis?
It's a permanent power, but obviously it's determined on a case-by-case basis. It's no different to if a code of conduct complaint came in against any assembly member. That power has been delegated to the monitoring officer to determine the complaint, and that's the stage of the process that we are currently at with this complaint.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I do think it's important to distinguish between the first ones, which is covered by the statutory process of what the monitoring officer has to do, and the process of determining what's a serious complaint. And I think there's in my own mind, generally, not wishing to comment on the ones before us, is about the GLA Code of Conduct, where we just might need to do some more work. These are inherited cases that you've got, Rory, albeit they are to the post, aren't they? You've not done these. It's a tidying up exercise of something you've inherited and come to a conclusion on. But we should look further, I think, generally about the GLA Code of Conduct, because we're dealing with 2 different beasts here, it seems to me, albeit for a Police and Crime Committee, because the nature of this committee is different from other GLA or a London Assembly Scrutiny Committee, if there were other complaints arising from that.
Yes, Chair, that is correct. And obviously, once the determination has been made that it's not a serious complaint, then it falls back under the GLA ethical standards regime, which is why obviously, those powers are delegated to the monitoring officer. If a complaint was to come in against you in your capacity as an assembly member, I would determine that complaint, obviously consulting with the GLA's appointed independent person. As I say, there's a distinction in the process between consulting with the Police and Crime Committee as to whether it's a serious complaint and informing the Police and Crime Committee of the outcome once it's been determined it's not a serious complaint and it goes through the GLA ethical standards regime.
Okay, so is everyone happy and clear now? So can I ask the committee to note that the Police and Crime Committee, as London's statutory police and crime panel, established under the Policing Reform and Social Responsibility Act of 2011, has delegated to the GLA monitoring officer its functions of handling complaints about the Mayor's conduct under the regulations. Can I ask the committee also to note that the current monitoring officer has, after consulting with the GLA's independent person, determined the complaints under the GLA ethical standards regime and decided that no further action needs to be taken with these complaints, and to note that a copy of the current monitoring officer's initial assessment and the reasons for his decision are appended to the report at item 8. Are we happy to note all of that?
No.
Thank you. So can I also ask the committee to note its work programme for the 23-24 Assembly year? And to note the, I'm just going to tell you that the next meeting of the committee is scheduled to take place on Wednesday the 20th of September at 10 a.m. in the chamber at City Hall. I have no urgent business. Sorry? I have no urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting.